Good day, all. Today we're going to be discussing just briefly the sort of the Industrial Revolution, its causes, and its impacts. The Industrial Revolution is a period from roughly about about 1750, really up until the present, where there is a change in the way that work is done and how people are active in the production of materials. So it starts largely in Western Europe. Typically, the first sort of places that we say that it starts are in the United Kingdom and France, and then sort of the UK at the end of the end of the 18th century. And in England, it's really because, or I should say in the United Kingdom, it's largely because of something called the enclosure movement. In the enclosure movement, what happens is there is a large group of people who are sort of sent off their land because of work that can now be done by uh, better better farming techniques and more efficient uses of farmers' times. So what happens as a result of that is you have more people being sent off the land, and you have groups of people who are now alienated from the land and really looking for another job. I have the word Jethro Tull, or the name Jethro Tull, up here, and he invents the seed drill, which is this mechanism. Sorry, over here to the right hand side of the screen, and that sort of illustrates two things, right? One is that there's better farming methods in Europe, or particularly in Britain, starting in the 18th century. But you also have sort of this tradition of tinkering and people using better methods to try and develop new techniques, right? Whether that's tinkering with seeds to increase better yield, whether that's fixing items to create better products. It's a way of people using their skills in Britain to make their lives better and the lives of others better. So you have that happening in Europe, or in Britain in particular. And Britain is also primed in other ways, right? Britain has this new land that is freed up as people have been kicked off the land. But you also have greater money, right? Britain by the mid 18th century is the wealthiest country in the world. It has colonies throughout the globe: Canada, the 13 in the United States, what becomes the United States, the Caribbean, it has India, it has parts of Africa, it has parts of South Asia. So Britain has a tremendous plot of land, and it's very wealthy. And subsequently, also the material that is used in developing factories and new developments are also involved in capital in the shipping industry, right? If you need capital to stock a boat, you're going to need banks and insurance companies, and Britain has that, so that when you want to turn that into a factory, that's another part of it. So Britain is particularly well suited for the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so let's just jump around here, right? The first major industry that is important to the Industrial Revolution is the textile industry. And Britain, once again, is in a really strong position for that, right? Britain has, in the north of Britain, Scotland, particularly by the late 18th century, has a really growing sheep and wool industry. And quite frankly, everybody needs clothing. So there's a set market in terms of fabric production. So because of that, there's really great demand for fabric and textiles, and there's a lot of tinkering that goes on with that. So you have the invention of things like the spinning jenny, the water loom, the power loom. Um, Later in the century, right, when cotton becomes more productive, you have the cotton gin developed by Eli Whitney in the 1790s. So you have all of these different products that are really catching up and creating more goods for people to wear and to use. And then that mechanization is translated into other fields, right? Whether that's coal extraction, or whether that's food production, and it's something that continues to be used. You also have the use of the division of labor. Adam Smith's idea, developed in his book in 1776, The Wealth of Nations. It's a way for people to divide up the jobs that they are good at. And there's a separation of what people are good at, and they become specialists in one piece of production. It speeds up production. It also helps sort of get people who are very efficient at one task. So it helps create a system whereby production can be increased exponentially. Along with the use of textile, the other real major invention that is important is steel, right? So steel and iron have been around, have been used for hundreds of years, by the 1700s. But steel becomes really important because what it does is it allows for the expansion of urbanization, right? One of the major impacts of the Industrial Revolution is not just that there are factories and quicker output, but one of the big impacts is that people start moving to cities. Because you want to be closer to your job, particularly if you're working 14 hours a day or 12 hours a day or 10 hours a day, whatever you are, you don't want to have a long commute on top of that. So people start moving towards cities. And as cities begin to grow, you also need bigger places to put them. So there needs to be apartment buildings. And stone or wood are great buildings material for smaller structures, but they are not necessarily great for taller structures. And steel allows for that, right? So for the viewers that are here in New York City, we have things like the Triangle, the Flatiron Building, which is in Lower Manhattan or Midtown or Chelsea, the Flatiron District. And it is built by steel in the mid-1800s. And it works, what is it, 10, 12 stories. So it becomes a sort of symbol of engineering greatness. And you have others being built, obviously, that help grow the cities. And that's happening in New York, London. It's happening all over the world. So that people are starting to flock to cities, and cities are growing at exponential rates. And it's because of steel. Along with that, you also have the development of the train tracks and the use of steel to make locomotives, and the railroad really becomes one of those symbols of great growth in the Industrial Revolution, right? People being able to travel much quicker, and it's because of the Bessemer process, which makes steel production not just better, it's also cost less, right? So the Bessemer process, so steel is iron where the impurities have been burnt off. Through the Bessemer process, which is essentially the injection of oxygen into molten iron, it heats up the ore hotter, and it means that the steel can be burnt, the impurities can be burnt off much easier. So this makes superior metals at a cheaper cost, and it's really helpful for those two, the urbanization and the train systems. And that's sort of what this slide is trying to tell you, right? That you have the first railroads being developed in 1814 by a guy named George Stephenson. But the other major thing here is Robert Fulton. So Robert Fulton is an English gentleman who develops the first steam engines in England, and then he moves over to the United States, particularly New York City, where he begins a shuttle service between New York and Brooklyn, I should say Manhattan and Brooklyn, and then ultimately up to Albany. And though these are at first a very inefficient and very slow process, where you could get up to Albany in something like 12 hours, that was lightning speed relative to what people had done previously, right? Whether if you're going on a boat up the Hudson River, it could take days because you're going against the current, so it would take a long time, or it would take by horse and carriage, it could take multiple days. So the invention of the steamboat is really significant there as well. Finally, the last real major thing that I want to discuss here is the impact of this, right? The division of labor is something that we talked about a few moments ago, but the separation out of labor is really an important side effect of the Industrial Revolution. This means that production can be much cheaper because it's much quicker, and that's really a significant thing, but we talked about that. The other four things that are on the board here are sort of very significant as well. The first is that there's a change in time structure. When you are a farmer, you control your time, right? Sun up to sundown is typically what we're told, but more importantly, it's really that you, as a farmer, decide when you sow your plants and when you do all those things that a farmer needs to do. It is not somebody telling you what to do. But when the Industrial Revolution comes in and people start working in factories, that changes. Now you're looking at a boss who is telling you when you should when you should be at work, when you should do the different tasks that you are required to do. So it really changes sort of who is directing your time. There's also urbanization, people moving away from smaller towns into larger villages. And the story of the last 200 years, from roughly the early 1800s to the early 2000s, has really been the story of urbanization and the story of growing of cities and towns, and the reduction of farming and smaller communities. There is also one good thing about the Industrial Revolution, and that is the growth of steady pay, right? Although people were being paid pennies on the dollar, one of the good things is at least you're getting a steady pay, right? You were earning a set wage, which, if you're a farmer, one of the bad things about farming is that it can be very risky. If you have a bad harvest, if a frost comes early, there could be major damages done to a person's livelihood. But at least if you're working in a factory, if you work your 12 hours, 14 hours a day, you're getting paid that 12 or 14-hour wage. And finally, the last big thing here is technological unemployment, something that we are still experiencing today with computerization. People losing their jobs based on technology. So the first real example of that is that weavers are losing their job to power looms and the spinning jenny. But also, as the carriages start to go away, once you have the railroad that can move people, there is a significant drop in the number of jobs that people have. Or I should say jobs change, I guess is probably a better way to say that. That's something obviously that we are still experiencing in 2019 as automation and computerization become more of the trend. We are in a new wave of technological unemployment, and people are experiencing that globally, obviously also here in North America or in the United States, but that is something that is being experienced internationally. We also might think of this as outsourcing, right? In 2019, we can move goods, we can move people across the globe, or move jobs across the globe, and people can do it remotely. So that's another piece of that. So finally, the last big thing that I would like to discuss is the use of child labor and the conditions that children are experiencing. Right, children, and I should say all people, but children I think are obviously they're far more innocent and they're being taken advantage of. So people in general are working in terrible conditions, but children as young as 8, 9, even maybe as young as 6, are working in factories in deplorable conditions for hours at a time. And that's really creating a very unstable situation for children. It's breaking down family structures that are very significant. Obviously, kids are developing. And parents are working a lot, children are working a lot. And so children are working in very poor conditions. And this young woman here, about 8 or 9 years old, working in a factory. This photo I think is always engaging. A young man about 6 or so, too small to even reach the top shelf of the machine, standing on top of it. So a very dangerous situation. These guys were known as breakers. These were coal operators who would go down, and their job was to break the coal away from the larger rocks. And guys as young as 7, 8, 9, 10 are working in these pits. Look at their face covered in coal soot, which is very dangerous. Right, coal soot can cause black lung, a disease of the respiratory system. And these young men, obviously are not wearing respiratory. You could see based on this, there's no sort of light coloring around their mouth. So these young men are experiencing really terrible conditions and setting themselves up for lifetimes of hazardous conditions. Right. This is a great picture too. Another young man selling newspapers on the street. Right, so tall that he doesn't even reach the bottom of the light post, and they selling these newspapers while his parents ostensibly are out working on their own. So the Industrial Revolution, although it has some great things, making commodities cheaper and more available, it has great human impact too, whether it's technological unemployment or men, women, and children working in terrible conditions.